In our last session, we unpacked the evolution of the web through to today and what lies not far ahead of us, and we saw how there were many benefits to the advancements of technology. We also saw how when it comes to how we use our devices every day, this can come at some costs. We grasped a general understanding of what these devices, smartphones, have done to society, and maybe you've noticed a few worrying signs in your own personal life. We also went through this list of questions that we've probably all asked ourselves at some point, and we answered a few of those. And now, you might be thinking so far that we've been focusing mainly on the negatives about technology and smart devices. But as said in the previous talk, I fully acknowledge the amazing benefits that they bring to us. But these questions behind me are to answer the overarching question, and that is, at what cost? I'd like to clarify that we are looking for facts, realities, and evidence to answer these questions. If that happens to have negative connotations, then that is what it is. That's the reality. Of course, I would love to talk to anyone afterwards about any of these talks or the things that we've spoken about so far. But tonight, we're going to continue answering these questions centered around one of the most precious things to us, and that being our children. Now, specifically, we're going to be looking at the age, well, below the age of 18. We're going to consider how smart devices are linked to a range of physiological and mental behavioural problems as well. And we're going to go through quite a few of those. Now, another reason why we're going to focus on children is because God also thinks that this young, influential group is very important. God has this to say about children. Children are a heritage from the Lord, and offspring are a reward from Him. So God has given us our children. They are a blessing from Him. And what does He want us to do with them? He wants us to show the ways of God through our example as parents. He goes on in Ephesians, "Fathers or parents, do not exacerbate your children. Instead, bring them up in the training and instruction of the Lord." Now, parents have the responsibility to reflect God's example in their family environment and to do the best they can to set a godly example and raise their children to know and love God and Jesus. Parenting is not easy. I know that, and I only have one child. But amongst all of the great things it can bring, it can be stressful, and it can be exhausting, and it can be frustrating, and it can bring out the best and the worst in any parent. But hopefully tonight we can explore a few opportunities where we can positively influence our kids in everyday life. And the first thing we're going to focus on is sleep. Now, can overusing smart devices disrupt our children's sleep patterns, or even ours? A lot of these things that we're going to focus on are studies in relation to children, but really the same can be applied to adults as well. So can overusing smart devices disrupt sleep patterns? Well, a study conducted in 2017 in the USA titled "Decreases in Self-Reported Sleep Duration Among US Adolescents and Links to New Media Screen Time," they used a random nationally representative sample of nearly 70,000 children with the aim of assessing whether sleep duration is linked to new media screen time. And what they found was this. They found compared to 2009, adolescents in 2015 were 16 to 17% more likely to report sleeping less than 7 hours a night on most nights, with an increase around the 2012 mark. Now, note that it says between 2011 and 2013, so 2012. Now, that's a date that we're going to see constantly throughout our study tonight. Now, why is 2012 so relevant? Because that was the year where the iPhone achieved market saturation. And what that means is that the majority of society owned a smart device or owned an iPhone. So that's a significant period in time, and as we go through these, you'll see a number of graphs that have an immediate spike in and around between 2007, because that's when it was first launched, and 2012 was the next one. But they go on to say this: there is a clear exposure-response relationship between electronic devices after 2 or more hours per day. So in this graph, we can see that dose-response relationship, can't we? We can see how on left to right it shows the number of hours per day, and top to bottom it shows the percentage of adolescents sleeping less than 7 hours a night. Now, something to note about this graph is it has this funny little dip at the beginning, and then it's an exponential curve. And as we go through a few of these other graphs later on in the study, it's really near the end of the talk, we're going to see how so many other studies have exactly the same trajectory and trend line. And what that gives us is a lot of confidence that cross-examining this same data with different studies is producing the same results. But what is the main driver for this increase? What is the main driver for this increase? And that is smart device usage. As you can see, another extract from this study, it clearly shows the rise in electronic device usage alongside the rise in short sleep duration, but, interestingly, the fall of TV in our lives. Now, this graph breaks it down, smart device usage, into a few extra areas, but we'll read this quote first. Other activities associated with short sleep duration, such as homework time, working for pay, and TV were relatively stable or reduced over this time period, making it unlikely that these activities caused the sudden increase in short sleep duration. Now, as said before, this graph here breaks down smart device usage into the main things that we do on those devices. And as we can see, that is social media, which is leading the trend and going gangbusters up to 2015, very closely followed by internet and news. Now, we know from the previous study that we saw last session from Deloitte is that these are the two main activities of choice when people go onto their smartphones. So it's no surprise then that it's directly correlated to the rise in short sleep duration. But on the decrease are paid jobs. Now remember, this is 18 and below, so that's not surprising. And of course, watching TV. But why is this significant? Why are we going through all of this? The study goes on to say, mounting evidence suggests that sufficient sleep duration is crucial for healthy mental and physical functioning. Short sleep duration has been linked to obesity, diabetes, cardiovascular disease, metabolic dysregulation, and a variety of psychological and behavioural problems such as depression and substance abuse, and even all-cause mortality. So, they conclude the study by saying this: in the last decade, we have witnessed unprecedented shifts in the adoption and use of electronic media devices, especially among children and adolescents. Scientific evidence on the impact of this technology is now accumulating, and the findings presented here implicate the use of electronic devices and new media in abrupt and significant decreases in sleep time. And they go on to say that we should all be careful with this. Now, you might be thinking, well, that sounds a bit doom and gloom, and it sounds like a little bit of a stretch. How can sitting in front of a screen possibly cause all of those problems? Well, a study conducted in 2016 entitled TV Exposure Associated with Sleep Disturbances monitored 5 to 6 year old children to see if there was a correlation between TV viewing and sleep duration. And this is what they found. Oh, actually, that's this one. This is what they found. TV viewing, and particularly passive TV exposure, so that's TV in the background, not necessarily watching it, significantly increase the risk of sleeping difficulties, and parents should control the quantity of TV viewing and limit children's exposure to passive TV. Now, this study was done in 2006. That was 1 year before, that is 1 year before the iPhone was launched into society. And that is back in a time when TV was the #1 device of choice for people's pastime activity. But now, TV viewing has plummeted, and the rise of the smartphone has taken its place. Now, the challenge for us is now we can watch any show, anytime, anywhere we are. We don't have to be at home sitting in front of a TV. And that's exactly what people are doing. And we saw last week from that Deloitte study, the media consumption study, that told us how streaming video on demand services like Netflix and Stan are going crazy because of how cheap mobile data is today. You've only got to take one train trip into the city to notice a big difference in society. So, I've gone back. So, can it disrupt our sleep patterns? Well, we've seen quite clearly that it can. We've seen how social media and browsing news are the main contributing factors. And we've seen how short sleep duration has been linked to a range of physical and mental issues, which we will talk on in more detail later on in our study. But can being very social online lead to physical relationship issues? Now let's consider how this has affected the family environment just for a moment. 3 separate studies conducted at Stanford University in the USA from 2001 to 2005 conducted research around internet use within an everyday family environment. And the consensus was, in short, no matter how time online is measured, and no matter which type of social activity is considered, time spent on the internet reduces time spent face-to-face relationships. Time spent on the internet at home has a strong, significant negative influence on the time spent with family members. Now, another study in 2009 titled Opportunity for Interaction analysed interactions among dual-income families after 3 p.m. when the parents came home from work, and whether technology influenced these initial reactions with their kids. And amongst many things, they found a high level of distraction encountered specifically towards fathers when they reunited with their children. And this is what they had to say. Distraction was displayed by at least one child in the family in over 2/3 of the 29 father-child reunions. Fathers were more likely to be the recipients of distraction from at least one child in the family than were mothers. I think this is particularly alarming, especially when it comes to another core commandment that God has given us. Children, obey your parents in the Lord, for this is right. Honour your father and mother. This is the first commandment with a promise, that it may go well with you and that you might live long in the land. Now, how can we gain the respect of our kids? How can we expect them to get off devices or to stop watching TV if we are not setting that example first as parents and enforcing our right as a parent to say no to certain things for our kids? What these studies implicate is that smart device usage embedded within the family environment reduced the amount of time that parents could positively lead, teach, and influence their children. And how much harder is that going to become as technology and our day-to-day life become seamlessly integrated, as we saw last week? Let's now step outside the family environment and just quickly consider general physical interactions with people. There is no doubt that this new generation is experiencing a revolutionary choice to either talk to someone face-to-face or text them. And they've had that opportunity from when they're a tiny kid. So it's always been around. Furthermore, where their actions are removed from the consequences. as an example, you say something hurtful over a message, you never get to see the implications of that message, which is translated into a lack of empathy in many parts of life. And we're going to look at empathy specifically a little bit later on. Now, we have made it acceptable for people to hide in their phone in all kinds of social situations. As we saw last week, how fobbing is a phrase that's been coined to talk about how people fob people off. They ignore someone that they're talking to face for a notification or something else on their phone that pops up. And we saw also last week how 90% of cell phone owners reported using their phones during their most recent social activity. So that's 90% of all of us, and I think that's probably right. I know I certainly have. But I'm sure you've noticed this even amongst children, but also even your own peers. Now, this study, conducted in 2009, titled Well Connected, The Biological Implications of Social Networking, analysed over a 20-year period the social implications of technology. And really, are you surprised with those results? It seems dead obvious, doesn't it, that the rise in electronic media usage should be coupled with then the decline in physical social interaction. Now, this graph only goes to 2007. And what happened in 2007? The iPhone was launched. Now, these are the key dates that we'll keep coming back to. It's 2007, when it was launched, and 2012, when it had market saturation. And you'll see these two dates constantly pop up in the studies and the research. So if this graph continued on to the present day, we should expect it to have a sharp increase in terms of electronic media usage and a sharp decrease in social interaction. But the study obviously wasn't in that period of time. Now, another study conducted in Turkey, entitled Facebook Addiction Among University Students in Turkey, interviewed almost 1,000 students with the aim of understanding their addiction levels with Facebook. Now, they grouped them into either addicts, a risky category, and non-addicts. So there was 3 distinct categories. And to effectively group them, researchers examined the psychological and other activities alongside the amount of time they spent on those platforms. Now, they didn't define a specific number of hours per day that grouped people into either risky, non-addicts or addicts. It was a combination of time and how the social platform made them feel. Now, this table here shows us that when people first join Facebook, 79.7% are non-addicts. So, you don't really know what to do on there. You sort of throw a few sheep at people, poke a few people back in the day, and you don't really do much else. And 80% of people didn't really use it that often. But if we keep looking down, we can see that by the time someone has had it for 5 years, there is an 11.8% decrease in the non-addict category, and an increase is taken up in the risky and in the problematic Facebook use, in the addict category. So what this tells us quite clearly is that the longer we have these platforms for, the more likely we are to use them, and the more likely we are to develop problematic social media use. Now, I'm not saying we should all get off Facebook. I know it has its place. I'm simply showing you evidence of what happens over a longer period of time. That's just what it is. Now, to bring our thoughts on social networking to a close, the Bible has this to say: "Finally, brethren, whatever things are true, whatever things are honest, whatever things are just, whatever things are pure, whatever things are lovely, and whatever things are of good report, if there be any virtue, if there be any praise, think on these things." And in Psalm 101, "I will not set before my eyes anything that is worthless." Now, there is no doubt that the far majority of our time spent on these platforms is time better spent elsewhere. But it's hard to limit our usage, isn't it? It's hard to do that because we've already seen from last week that they're designed to be addictive. So if we want to make a change, we must make a conscious effort or it won't work. It's not just going to happen that we won't use these devices. They're designed to hook you. So we have to make, if we want to change, we have to make a conscious decision to change. So, can being very social online lead to physical relationship issues? Well, to describe, to sort of bring a few studies together, I've done this amazing circle graph thing. And this is extracts from a number of studies that we've looked at this evening and last week. And we'll start at the top. The more time we spend on devices, the less time we spend with real people. We just saw that, didn't we? It's pretty obvious. Now, the less time we spend with real people, the more isolated we feel. And the more isolated we feel, the more friends we gather on Facebook. We saw that last week. And the more friends we gather on Facebook, the more likely we are to be addicted because we're using it more, right? And the more addicted we are, the more we feel lonely because we realise that the friends that we have online are not as meaningful as the friends that we have face to face. We saw that last week. And therefore, we spend more time on our devices, and so on and so on. And it sort of is a spiral that goes down and down and down and becomes quite a depressive thing to some people. Not everyone. We're not all like that. But to some people, that's just what happens. But I think it's worth pointing this out. So it's a dangerous cycle that children under the age of 18 are particularly influenced by. But that's not to say that adults are exempt from it either. We are all subject to the addiction of these platforms, and as we'll find out later when talking about gaming in particular, the impacts of these activities actually have no age boundaries. But does it affect neurological development or structure of the brain? Now, in this next section on brain development, we're going to consider 4 things: brain structure, language acquisition, empathy, and attentional damage. Now, as parents, we all want to maximise the future potential of our kids. I would struggle to find a parent that would not want that. However, that is exactly what we might be doing without realising it by exposing our kids too early to digital devices. Now, last week we heard from a few people, Simon Sinek, Tristan Harris, and Dr. Mark Griffiths, who spoke about how social platforms have been designed to exploit our brain's vulnerabilities by getting our brain to release dopamine, which is probably a word that you've heard quite often lately. Dopamine, which is a highly addictive feel-good chemical released by our brain when we do activities like drinking, gambling, and smoking. Now, following on the same vein of that thought process, this is what Dr. Victoria Dunkley says about this, and she's a psychiatrist and an expert in screen time and author of the book Reset Your Child's Brain. Screen time, particularly the interactive kind, acts like a stimulant not unlike caffeine, amphetamines, or cocaine. Now, just remember that she said that, caffeine, amphetamines, or cocaine, because later on we're going to see from other studies the brain structure of substance abuse people is almost identical with those that have internet addiction problems. Now, while playing computer games is thought to be more stimulating than passively just watching TV or a cartoon, evidence indicates that this interactive media is associated with limited neurological activity. So, for example, a study conducted in 2011 looking at the differences in cerebral blood flow between children playing computer games and children doing very simple arithmetic, adding up single-digit numbers, they found that the computer games only stimulated activity in those parts of the brain associated with vision and movement, as compared with arithmetic-stimulated activity, which activated areas throughout the front, right and left frontal lobes. playing computer games did not do that. The findings were described by the World Federation of Neurology as computer games are halting the process of frontal lobe development and affecting children's ability to control antisocial elements of their behaviour. Alarmingly, computer games stunted the developing mind. So what functions does the frontal lobe manage? Interestingly, another study in the medical journal Pediatrics in 2011, entitled The Immediate Impacts of Different Types of Television on Young Children's Executive Function, examined only a small number of minutes of TV viewing on the brain's frontal lobes in 4-year-old children. Now, these prefrontal skills are described as their executive function, which is what we have here. And the executive function, which is in the frontal lobes, is what guides and directs goal-directed behaviour, attention, working memory, inhibitory control, problem-solving, self-regulation, and delay of gratification. Now, it doesn't take us long to realise that they are core, fundamental skills to have in life. But we can see from these studies that both computer games and watching TV have the same impact on the brain, and that is the suppression of these core life skills. Now, this is particularly alarming because in the USA, a number of southern states have now classified computer games as a sport in the school curriculum as an alternative to PE. Imagine how that's going to go down. But based on, we're not going to go through the article, but you're more than welcome to read it yourself. But based on the research that we've just considered, this is going to have dramatic negative effects on the social and academic ability of these kids. And maybe not long from now, the Australian education system might adopt a similar way of thinking, as is the course of the world. Australia usually follows suit. Now, another article, which I don't have here, I was reading this afternoon, spoke about how the Olympic Games Committee is considering bringing esports are gaming, into the Olympics as a non-medal event to begin with. So that's really interesting, isn't it? And it begins as a non-medal event, but very quickly that will become a medal event, and there'll be numerous esports that people can win at the Olympic Games. So another really interesting thing. But as we saw last week, the biggest rise in screen time in a child's life is in the most impressionable part of it too, being between the ages of 14 to 17. Now, the Bible asks this question in the book of Psalms: how can a young person keep their way pure? How can they do that? When you think about all the things that are going to be pressed upon our kids, especially this new generation coming up, how are they going to be able to keep their way pure? It goes on to say, by guarding it according to your word. Now, our role as parents is to provide our children with everything they need to make the right decisions, as much as we can, starting with our example. The more we guide them from the beginning, it will help them when they have to make choices. Proverbs has this to say: train up a child in the way they should go, and when they are old, they will not depart from it. I think that is just, again, reiterating the influence the parents can play in the outcome of their child. But as we know, children obviously end up making their own choices, so it's not a recipe for success all the time. But it does give us a great chance. But what about educational content on screens? What about that? Now, despite claims that educational DVDs or TV shows are beneficial to young children, a study in 2007 on children under 2 years of age showed that there were no positive effects and that there were no benefits whether children watched educational or Oprah, as it mentioned in the study. educational or Oprah. So in particular, the researchers found that for every hour per day spent watching specially designed baby DVDs and videos such as Brainy Einstein and Brainy Baby, developed by Disney, children under 16 months actually understood an average of 6 to 8 words fewer compared to those that didn't watch them. And the research concluded by saying this: the evidence is mounting that they are of no value and may in fact be harmful. Given what we know now, I believe the onus is on the manufacturers to prove their claims that watching these programs can positively impact children's cognitive development. The bottom line is the more a child watches baby DVDs and videos, the bigger the effect. The amount of viewing does matter. Now, another paper published in a European medical journal, Acta Pediatrica, in 2009, also concluded this: no studies to date have demonstrated benefits associated with early infant TV viewing under 2 years of age. The preponderance of existing evidence suggests the potential for harm. Now, according to an article in Time magazine in 2009, numerous studies concluding the same thing. Disney actually offered refunds to parents who bought the Baby Einstein DVDs, as Disney couldn't actually support their claims that it increased childhood cognitive function. But does this even really matter? Does it even have a long-term effect? We know children's brains grow and change, so is it something that they will just grow out of? A study in 2009 titled Your Brain on Google analysed brain function in young adults and found that when using the internet, the areas of the brain involving empathy showed virtually no increase in stimulation. And they said this: young people are growing up immersed in this technology, and their brains are more malleable, more plastic, and changing than with other brains. As the brain evolves and shifts its focus towards new technological skills, it drifts away from fundamental social skills. And we just saw that, didn't we, with the studies relating to gaming. And this describes how the behaviours and habits that we instill in our children end up defining who they are in the future. And I feel like everyone really knows that already, but it's just a matter of finding things that actually prove that for you. The child's brain is mouldable, absolutely, and it can be shaped and reshaped. But there comes a time where things start to lock down and the brain becomes set in its structure. Now, the University of Michigan and University of Rochester Department of Psychiatry undertook a meta-analysis combining the results of 72 different studies between 1979 and 2009 on empathy. Among almost 14,000 students were surveyed. The aim was to see if technology had an impact on the levels of empathy in the students during this period of time. And the investigators had little flattery for this new generation. We found the biggest drop in empathy after the year 2000. College kids today are about 40% lower in empathy than their counterparts of 20 or 30 years ago. Many people see this current generation of university students, as Generation Me, as one of the most self-centred, narcissistic, competitive, confident and individualistic in recent history. And I just love this part. It's not surprising that the growing emphasis on self is accompanied by a corresponding devaluation of others. And it's just a product of what society has really given them, isn't it? It's not really their fault. It's just what they've been born into. But like we keep coming back to, our role as parents is to try and guide and shape them through this journey. And that's why it is so important for us to consider. Now, one of the other reasons it's so important for us to consider is because God describes love and empathy and compassion as a foundation stone of faith. In Corinthians, so now faith, hope, and love abide. These three. But the greatest of these is love. Now, in this particular section of Scripture, it talks about the amazing things that people could do with the Holy Spirit gifts in that day. How they could heal the sick, they could prophesy, they could raise the dead. But Paul says here, if they didn't have love, if the motivation behind what they did wasn't because they loved God, then it was nothing. Now, to love someone or something takes time. Many of us would understand that. And when we consider all the challenges our children have to live through, and let's not forget the whole peer pressure aspect to all of this, we should ask ourselves the question, are we giving them the best chance of loving God and loving Jesus? Now, a study in 2007 focusing on extensive television viewing and the development of attention and learning difficulties in 14 to 21-year-olds concluded this: frequent television viewing among adolescents may be associated with risk for development of attentional problems, learning difficulties, and adverse long-term educational outcomes. Youths who watched 1 or more hours of TV per day at a mean age of 14 were at elevated risks of poor homework completion, negative attitudes towards school, poor grades, and long-term academic failure. Now, going on, a recent longitudinal study in the medical journal Pediatrics in 2010 included computer game exposure in this, which is particularly interesting, in its assessment of attentional issues. And it widened its age range to include people between 8 and 24. And yet the effects seemed ageless. Television viewing and playing video games each are associated with increased subsequent attentional problems in childhood, late adolescence, and early adulthood. So the effects of these pastime activities, which are really fun, right? Like, I used to do it all the time. It was a lot of fun, but in the end, what these studies clearly tell us is that if we never get ourselves out of that rhythm, they can develop into long-term impacts on the brain. So, does it affect neurological development or structure of the brain? Well, we've seen how executive function, such as goal-directed behaviour, attention, problem-solving, and self-regulation, are all affected with digital exposure. We've also seen how there's actually no such thing as educational programs for kids that actually stimulate cognitive and brain development. We've seen how there's, in general, a lack of empathy in today's new generations, and regardless of age, computer games and other screen time instill attentional problems. And we also know that a foundation stone for even believing in God is love. But what about contributing to obesity? A study conducted in Ireland in 2014 surveyed over 8,500 children aged 9 with the purpose to examine whether the influence of screen time and personal activity was linked with obesity. Now, this is what they found. Indicators such as having a TV in the bedroom or owning a mobile phone were significantly related to being overweight and obese regardless of the activity. Now, this graph is a really interesting one. It's super boring, I know, but it's actually really interesting. And we've got here on the left, we've got the overall, and then we've got boys and then girls. But if we focus in on the colours, which are all grey, the one on the far left is low screen time, high personal activity. That's the group. And you can see that they hardly even register on this scale. The next shade of grey across, which is that lighter grey, is low screen time, low personal activity. And you can see there is a significant jump in terms of the risk of them developing a weight problem. The next group, which I find the most interesting, is high screen time, high personal activity. And what this describes for us, you'll notice that it's actually more than the other group. It tells us that if you have kids who are highly active and they're just out doing sports all the time, but they also have a huge amount of screen time usage, they're almost twice as likely still to develop weight issues than someone who doesn't exercise as much, but also doesn't watch as much screen time. So that's really interesting, because it goes on to say, it seems that both high screen time and low personal activity contribute independently to an increased likelihood of overweight or obesity. Data from this analysis also suggests that during childhood, screen time may have more of an influence on weight than personal activity. Isn't that really interesting? Of course, the darkest line is high screen time, low personal activity, and they're obviously the highest. Now, a lot of people think, and we've all sort of thought this for a long time, that personal activity is the main thing that we need to encourage with children. But what this study clearly shows us is that if we encourage kids to run around outside, but then we let them spend hours a day with a smart device, it's actually worse than letting them do no personal activity, but take that device away from them. It must be a combination of personal activity and low screen time if we are to reduce the likelihood of our children developing weight problems. And of course, another factor in all of this is the importance of a good diet. Now, in Australia, this is a very relevant topic for us to consider when we think of the following studies. So, 3 different studies in 2017 and 2018 conducted in Australia, the USA and worldwide all concluded the same thing, that obesity took a sharp incline around 2012 after a number of years of being steady or slightly declining. Now, why 2012? Well, as we have already said, it's a key date we keep coming back to, and that's when almost everyone had an iPhone. That's when it achieved market saturation. But how could smart devices actually increase body fat? It seems a bit ridiculous, doesn't it? In the Journal of the American Medical Association, Harvard researchers reported that beyond merely displacing physical activity, watching TV appears to slow metabolism and burns fewer calories than compared to other sedentary activities such as sewing, reading, writing, or even driving a car. And that's because it lights up different parts of the brain. As we saw before, when we're doing things that are just screen related, it's only motion and vision and movement that are the areas of the brain that are lit up. Whereas when we're doing other kind of activities such as sewing, reading, writing, or even simple arithmetic, it's lighting up our frontal lobes, which are, well, according to this study, they burn more calories. So there you go. But this is what they say in the study. Prolonged TV watching directly related to obesity and a diabetes risk. Now, this study was conducted back in 2003, and this was 4 years before the iPhone launched. But the same applies today, and even more so, because as we said already, we now have streaming video on demand services accessible through our phones wherever we are, whenever we are. And I just was in the lunchroom today, and there was 3 people that were on their phones watching something on Netflix. And it was so funny, not that one, but a different example. I was on the way home on the train this week, and I sat next to this guy who pulled out his briefcase. He sat on his briefcase 3 phones, 3 smartphones. He had the same game running on all 3 phones, and he would do exactly the same thing on all of them. I think he'd figured out some hack to get extra points. And he was addicted to it, and the whole train trip home, he just couldn't stop. It was so funny to watch. And here I was next to him doing this, so it was so interesting. But, yeah, anyway, where was I? So yeah, we can access these things through our devices, and as we saw from our Deloitte study, that every single demographic has increased their uptake and adoption of streaming video on demand. We all have, haven't we? I'm sure all of us here have a Netflix account or a Stan account. I mean, why wouldn't you? I mean, who wants to wait for a TV show these days? You can just play it and it's there. It's brilliant. So, does it contribute to obesity? Well, irrespective of personal activity, screen time has a significant impact on children's health. And worldwide, this is obviously an issue that's been exacerbated by the availability of content through our smart devices. But are computers and smart devices helping or hurting academic performance or educational achievement? So, technology in the classroom has been a growing epidemic since the launch of the Discman. And I remember this at school, where you'd always have a few people in the class that would try to listen to music in one ear and everyone else in the other. It just seemed, I tried to do it once and it was just impossible. Now, these days, many schools give students either iPads or laptops to help with their learning. And at university, technology is obviously self-governed and moderated. But what impact is this having? Is it a good thing that we have these devices at school? Well, a study conducted in 2012 in the US endeavoured to assess this exact topic, specifically looking at phone usage, and they discovered this. Results show a significant negative correlation between in-class phone use and final grades, with use of cell phones corresponding to a drop of 9% on a 4-point scale where 4 equals A. These findings are consistent with other research suggesting that students cannot multitask nearly as effectively as they think that they can. Now, we can see here again a dose-response relationship. The more that we use it in class, the lower the grades become. Now, in a recent study entitled A Description of Facebook Use and Academic Performance, the results were perhaps unsurprising. There is a disconnect between students' claim that Facebook doesn't impact their studies and our findings showing that it definitely does impact their studies. And it goes on to say, a similar study found that 3/4 of Facebook users said they didn't believe spending time on the site affected their academic performance, and yet we found that their grades are about 20% lower. So, you know, we can sort of tell ourselves these things, and it's sort of put a cloud over the reality of what it's doing to us, but in the end, when we step outside of that and we look at statistically, well, what happens to people, these are the results. So politicians, parents and schools are under increasing pressure to incorporate more screen technology into education. Yet few people are aware of large, well-controlled studies that fail to support a presumption of this benefit. For example, a European-based study of 15-year-old students in 31 countries concluded that those using computers at school several times a week performed sizably and statistically significantly worse in both maths and reading than those who used them less often. Now, adults too have been encouraged to believe that computerised mental workouts and brain training devices are the bee's knees. But in another study, it says this: computerised mental workouts don't boost mental skills. There are absolutely no transfer effects from the training tasks, that the claims are completely unsupported. So that's when you can download apps on your phone which basically say that it's going to help with your cognitive development. These studies say, well, actually, like the brainy baby example, it's unsubstantiated claims. Now, as parents, we have to provide guidance on these things, don't we? And as teenagers and as young adults, you need to start putting your own rules in place to help manage your device usage. It's all about thinking beyond the present and understanding where these habits can statistically lead to. Now, the Bible has some great advice about thinking ahead. It says this: when you besiege a city for a long time, making war against it, in order to take it, you shall not destroy its fruit trees by wielding an axe against them. You may eat from them, but you shall not cut them down. Are the trees in the field human? Are they human, that they should be besieged by you? Only the trees that you know are not fruit trees or trees for food, you might destroy and cut down, that you might build your siege equipment. Now, when you first read that, and when Yana and I first read that, we were like, well, this totally doesn't relate to this topic. But It absolutely does. It's a fantastic passage, an obscure passage that you sort of come across and you could skip over very quickly, where it's talking about thinking beyond the now and making decisions that will affect the future for better. Now, the main message here that they're talking about is that when you're going to attack a city, which we're all preparing to do at some point, when you're preparing to attack a city, don't cut down the fruit trees and make your siege equipment from fruiting trees. Why? Because even though you'll be able to make your siege equipment very quickly, you're cutting down your food supply, meaning that in the future, when the siege continues, you'll run out of food. There's a lot of wisdom in that. It's very simple, but there's a lot of wisdom. Now, the same can apply to us. What present-day things are we doing that are starving us spiritually in the long run? What are we letting our kids do that is an advantage just for the day, but in the long run, hindering their development? So are they good or bad ideas to have computers at school? Well, we've seen how there's actually no evidence to support a personal computer at school. In fact, the evidence indicates it hurts learning performance. We've seen how increased phone use, especially social media in the classroom, yields lower results. We've seen how educational apps and games have no cognitive influence on our brain. And God wants us to think about how our actions today mean for the future. What our actions today mean for the future. But what about behaviour? And what about psychological well-being? The awareness of mental health has increased greatly over the last 2 decades. Interestingly, it correlates perfectly with the rise of smart devices and social platforms. Now, together, these two create environments where mental health issues, such as anxiety and depression, can be fostered. A study in the USA in 2016 assessed over 40,000 children to see ages 2 to 17 to assess if a correlation of screen time during leisure time was linked to anxiety or depression. And this is what they found. After 1 hour a day of use, more hours of screen time were associated with lower physiological well-being, less curiosity, lower self-control, more distractibility, more difficulty making friends, less emotional stability, and more difficult to care for, and had an inability to finish tasks. Now, we're going to zoom through a bunch of graphs. I'm not going to spend much time on any of them. But what I want you to notice from them is the same trend line appearing that we saw right at the beginning. Now, firstly, I'll just remind you of something we saw last week, and that was this: the average number of hours kids are spending on screens in their leisure time a day. 4.6 hours. And as we see there, the dose-response relationship between time or hours spent, the age of the child down the bottom versus the amount of time they're spending on those devices. And it's, of course, as the older they get, the more they consume. But let's now go through these slides very quickly. In terms of percentage of kids who argue too much with their caregivers, look at that trend line. It's exactly the same as the other one. After an hour a day, things get much harder. Interestingly, what these implicate is that if you give them a device up to an hour, it's kind of okay, depending on the age bracket. But we'll talk about that right at the end. But again, percentage who argue too much with their caregivers, not curious or learning new things. Every single one of them. The youngest one, 2 to 5, is less so. But look at the exponential curve of 14 to 17 and all of the others. It's harder to... their percentage are not as curious or learning new things. Unable to remain calm when challenged. Again, the curve goes up. Percentage who don't finish tasks. Again, the curve goes up. Percentage ever diagnosed with anxiety or depression. Again, it goes up in every single age bracket. Percentage receiving medical treatment and percentage of medication for psychological issues during the last 12 months. And I'll just read to you this little section. children aged 14 to 17 with a screen time of around 7 plus hours a day are 293% more likely to require medication for psychological issues compared to those that use it for just 1 hour. So there is a dose-response relationship, and the amount of viewing does matter, and the content also matters too. It also goes on from what we saw right at the beginning, the very first graph that we looked at, short sleep duration. Again, we can see a completely separate study, but yielding the same results. Now, the conclusion of this study was, and I'll read you the last one, in summary, these results show a negative association between screen time and physiological well-being among children and adolescents. Now, if anything, it's at least clear that moderating time on these devices is warranted. We'll skip over, we'll quickly touch on this one. This is in relation to depression, and as we can see here, this study observed it over a 20-year period, and as we can see here, the key things are in and around 2007 and 2012, bang, the spike goes up in terms of people who are showing these depressive symptoms. We can see there it says between 2009-10 and 2015, 33% more adolescents exhibited high levels of depressive symptoms, 12% reported at least one suicide-related outcome, and 31% more died by suicide. And bang, 2007 and 2012, you can see them so clearly. When the stuff prior, all of this stuff, is on a downward trend, isn't it? Very interesting. Exposure-response relationship between electronic devices and having at least one suicide-related outcome. So, suicide-related outcome doesn't mean someone dies. It just means that they're exhibiting one of the 4 symptoms that will lead to that, and that is feeling hopeless for an extended period of time, serious consideration of suicide, making a plan to suicide, or attempting to suicide. So it's doing one of those things, and this graph shows us, with the amount of hours a day we spend on devices, the risk of exhibiting one of those increases exponentially. Now, I don't think we can get much more simple when the study concludes like this. All activities associated with higher depressive symptoms or suicide-related outcomes involved screens, and all activities associated with lower depressive symptoms did not involve screens. And I don't really know if we can make it any clearer than that. It really couldn't be laid out any easier for us. But what should we be doing then? Does the Bible provide any advice on this? Well, let's just quickly have a look at what the Proverbs say. Remove far from me falsehood and lying. Give me neither poverty nor riches. Feed me with the food that's needful for me, lest I be full and deny you and say, who is the Lord? Or lest I be poor and steal and profane the name of my God. Now, last week we saw how God warned us about idols. And we saw how an idol can be anything that draws our attention away from God and living his values. Now, this proverb follows on a similar vein, saying, remove far from me the things that will take me away from God. Why? Because otherwise, the simplicity that I have found in Jesus might start to be not so simple. And I will begin to ask, who is the Lord? So does it affect behaviour and psychological well-being? Well, we saw the negative dose-response relationship between screen time and kids, etc. We saw also how the more screen time that's consumed, there is a correlation in the likelihood of being diagnosed with depression or receiving medication for it. We've seen a massive jump in depression since 2007 and 2012, and we've seen, more importantly, that God wants us to rely on him for strength, to remove unnecessary things from our life that can cloud the simple message of Jesus. Now, how much should we give to our kids? Now, from 3 different studies, just start with this, there is nothing inherently wrong with smart devices, as I've said many times. It's what it gives us access to and how often we use it. Now, these studies that we looked at all this evening all point to a very, very similar conclusion, and that is that we need to seriously think about the amount of time that we give our kids phones and smart devices for. I think this one down here is probably the best one. My time's up. And it is actually. We're finishing in the next slide. But I think this one down here is actually a very good layout, because as we've seen in other studies, it does actually depend on the age of the child and the maturity of that child. So it is a staggered approach that we need to take, and I think that's a relatively good one. But as we saw in other studies, with all of those graphs, everything started turning to custard after an hour, every single one of them. So it's another thing that we have to think of. Now, over the last two sessions, we have answered these questions with the tick next to them, and next week we will be getting really practical and continuing to answer our questions, considering how technology is affecting those of us aged 19 and above, the group that is tasked with being the example for the younger to follow.